War pushes science into places where science should never go. That is not a metaphor. It is a documented fact, repeated in every conflict large enough to justify the abandonment of ethics in the name of survival. World War II produced the atomic bomb, produced medical experiments that cannot be described without the stomach turning, produced projects so classified that some have still not been fully revealed 8 decades later. But if the accounts of a handful of sailors, an eccentric scientist, and documents that appear and disappear from government archives are to be believed, in 1943, the United States Navy did not merely cross a scientific boundary. It tore something in the very fabric of reality. And what leaked through that tear was printed forever into the flesh of men who were simply doing their jobs at a shipyard in Philadelphia. To understand why anyone would approve an experiment of this nature, you need to understand the desperation of 1943. German submarines, the U-boats, were sinking Allied ships in the Atlantic at a scale that threatened to strangle the entire war effort. Tons of supplies, fuel, ammunition, and human lives were disappearing into the cold waters every single week. The Germans had developed sonar and detection technology that made Allied convoys vulnerable in ways that strategists could not solve. It was in this environment of operational despair that the idea took root. If you cannot hide the ships in the seas, hide them from perception. Make them invisible to radar. Make them invisible to light. Make them non-existent to any detection instrument the enemy possessed. The theoretical foundation came from an unlikely place. Albert Einstein had spent decades working on a unified field theory, an attempt to bring electromagnetism and gravitation together into a single mathematical framework. Fragments of it, combined with research into high-intensity electromagnetic fields, reportedly convinced a group of Navy scientists that it was possible to bend light and radar waves around a physical object using sufficiently powerful magnetic fields. The object would become, in practical terms, transparent, a warship that enemy radar would simply ignore. The USS Eldridge was a newly commissioned escort destroyer, technically suitable for the experiment because it was new, because its electrical systems could be adapted, and because it had the space needed to house the enormous electromagnetic generators. The crew on board that day in October 1943 did not fully know what they were being subjected to. Some accounts suggest the sailors were told they would be participating in a classified technical test. None of them were in any position to imagine what the fields about to be activated would do to matter, to space, and to their own bodies. When the generators were switched on, the first effect was the sound. A low-frequency hum that began below the threshold of human hearing, felt first in the sternum and in the teeth, before it was heard by the ears, and which escalated gradually into a roar that permeated the air, the metal of the deck, the bones of every man who was on board or anywhere near the shipyard. Witnesses unsure described the air around the Eldridge beginning to distort, like heat rising from asphalt on a summer day, but more intense, more wrong, with a quality that no natural description adequately captures. And then came the fog. It was green, not the green of any natural atmospheric phenomenon, not the green of phosphorus or oxidized copper, but a green that seemed to emit its own light, as dense as smoke, but behaving differently from smoke, coiling around the hull of the Eldridge, from the inside out, as if it were being born from the very metal of the ship. The fog swallowed the destroyer from deck to mast, and from bow to stern in an interval that witnesses estimated seconds. And then came the flash. Blue and white, intense enough to leave temporary visual marks on the eyes of those watching from the dock. A flash that lasted a fraction of a second and then extinguished everything. Where the USS Eldridge had been, there was only water. The ship had disappeared. If you feel that chill down your spine when you discover that secret military projects went far beyond anything any government has publicly admitted, hit that like button right now. This kind of story does not appear in textbooks, and that is exactly why it needs to be told here. The accounts diverge on how long the Eldridge remained absent. Some say minutes. Others say it was hours. There is a version claiming the ship briefly reappeared in the port of Norfolk, Virginia, 280 miles away, before returning to Philadelphia, which would imply not just invisibility, but teleportation, a possibility that pushes the story into territories that conventional physics refuses to inhabit. What all versions agree on is what happened when the ship came back. The Eldridge reappeared in the water exactly where it had been. The green fog was dissipating. The generators had been switched off or had failed, depending on the account. And from the docks, The teams approaching by boat to check on the condition of the ship heard, before anything else, the sounds, humans screaming coming from the deck. What the rescue teams found when they climbed aboard was something for which no military or medical training had prepared them. Part of their crew was in complete catatonia, sitting or lying where they were, eyes open and empty, not responding to any verbal or physical stimulus. Others were walking in circles, repeating words that made no sense. Some were in spontaneous combustion, a phenomenon that conventional science cannot explain, with flames that rescuers extinguished and that reignited on their own. Men vomiting incessantly, the body attempting to expel something that could not be expelled because it was not in the stomach. It was in every cell. But the central horror, the detail that appears in all independent accounts and that no rational explanation has managed to absorb, was at specific points on the deck and in the interior compartments of the ship. Several sailors had been physically fused to the steel hull of the Eldridge, not trapped by equipment or debris. Fused, arms entering the solid metal of the deck and ending on the other side as if the steel had been something the flesh had passed through and become lodged in during the crossing. Legs inserted into metal walls up to the thigh. In at least one reported case, a man with half his torso inside a steel structure that had solidified around him as if it had always been there. Some were dead, others were alive. The ones who were alive were screaming. The fusion of biological tissue and inorganic metal is impossible within the parameters of physics and chemistry that science knows. Flesh does not pass through steel. Steel does not envelop flesh like a liquid that solidifies. And yet, that was exactly what was in front of the rescue teams. On that deck, a visual and auditory and olfactory argument against everything that is supposed to be possible, screaming from inside a metal that should not have been capable of containing anything living. The Navy sealed the area immediately. Civilian witnesses who had observed the disappearance of the ship from the docks were individually approached in the hours that followed. The sailors who survived with the capacity to communicate were subjected to processes that available records do not describe with precision, but whose results are documentable. Several ended up committed to psychiatric institutions in the following years, diagnosed with schizophrenia or combat psychosis, unable to articulate any coherent narrative about what they had experienced, or refusing to speak about it with a terror that doctors described as disproportionate to any conventional combat experience. Some died in circumstances that their families considered suspicious. The name of the project was Rainbow. The official records of the United States Navy deny its existence. The logs of the USS Eldridge for the relevant period show the ship elsewhere, an inconsistency that researchers spent decades trying to reconcile without definitive success. Albert Einstein, when questioned about a possible connection to his unified field theory, denied any involvement, but the manuscripts of the advanced version of that theory, which he had worked on in the preceding years, were handed over to the United States Navy in 1943 and remained classified for decades. A detail that Einstein himself never publicly explained in a way that satisfied anyone who asked. Carlos Allende, the sailor, who decades later would describe the experiment in letters sent to a researcher in the electromagnetic field, was treated as a lunatic by the scientific community. But the details he provided, details he would have had no way of knowing if he had not been present, continued to resist any satisfactory explanation. That does not pass through the possibility that he was telling the truth. What happens when science ruptures something that should not be ruptured is a question that modern theoretical physics takes more seriously than it publicly admits. The possibility that electromagnetic fields of sufficient intensity can interact with the structure of space-time in ways that classical physics does not predict is discussed, in careful language surrounded by qualifications, in academic papers that never make headlines. What happened to the men of the Eldridge, Ivid Apaned, would be the grotesque and involuntary version of that experiment, the proof that reality has seams, and that when you force them with enough energy, what gets caught in them does not come out whole. If you want to keep uncovering the darkest conspiracies and the secret projects that governments prefer to bury rather than explain, subscribe to the Shadow IA channel right now and hit the notification bell so you never miss a video. And before you go, leave your answer in the comments below. Do you believe this grotesque experiment really happened and was covered up by the government? Or is it just a terrifying legend from World War II? Read through the comments, because in this kind of story, what each person chooses to believe reveals more about the real world than any classified document ever could.